We have been studying the book of Esther, which is the book immediately before the book of Job, if you find it difficult to locate it. And the story of Esther is history. Not made up, it's pure history. And that can be proven by comparing it with other historical Old Testament books. But it reads like a story, it reads like a novel. It's written in a particular style. And therefore, some people think the book of Esther is invented. It is just a story, but it isn't, it's history. And it dates to events that occurred around about 450 years before the birth of Christ. Get some idea of the time scale. And it concerns the Persian Empire, which was a vast empire in those days. And the whole message of the book is that God intervened in what we might otherwise consider random events to prevent the Jewish race being removed, being killed off. And had that happened, had there been a genocide of the Jews throughout the empire was so large that that virtually meant the Jews would be eliminated. And the book of Esther is all about the way that God, in his sovereignty, uses the circumstances of the day, good and bad, to bring about his purposes, which was to save the Jewish race, and secondly, to do that through the means of his servants. You know, God is a sovereign God. He is in control of everything. And when it rains, we're told that God sends the rain on the just and on the unjust. We don't have any say in that, do we? We don't have any part of that. God sends it, does it without our help. But when God is dealing with people, he very often uses his servants, people like Mordecai and Esther, in this case, uses his servants to fulfill and bring about his purposes. And that's a very important application. If you remember nothing else of this message this morning, remember that. This passage is all about the way God used Mordecai to bring about a situation in which God's purposes were furthered. Now, Mordecai was actually Esther's cousin, and he was nevertheless something like 20 years older than she was. And when her parents died, when she was a very young child, Mordecai took her under his wing and brought her up as if she had been his own daughter. And that underlies a lot of what we read here. Now, the passage we're looking at is from verse 19 of chapter 2 through to verse 23, which is not a long passage. And I'm going to read it now for the benefit of those listening to this on the podcast. Esther 2, verse 19. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and I think we must understand that as the door of the harem, not the king's gate, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Now, I'm not going to say anything about verses 19 and 20. They contain difficulties, exegetical difficulties, that would take us too far from what I want to say this morning. Perhaps come back to that in a future message on Esther, but we're really only going to look at verses 21 to 23, which begin in those days as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. And I'm having three headings because I always think it helps us work our way through a passage. The overall title of the sermon is this: God uses his servants to frustrate his enemies and further his purposes. And the three headings are: Mordecai sat in the king's gate, Mordecai saw the king's enemies, and Mordecai spoke through Esther to the king. Let's begin with the first of those headings. Mordecai sat in the king's gate. The king's gate plays a rather important part in the story of Esther. And so let me just point out a little bit about the layout of the palace, the king's palace. You often read in the book of Esther of Shushan the palace, or sometimes Shushan the citadel. And Shushan was an ancient city, and Shushan the palace was the king's palace, but it was separated from the city at large by a river, or by a moat. And the river made it impossible, really, to get into the king's palace without crossing the causeway, the bridge, which is visible by means of certain structures that are left archaeologically. You could only enter the king's palace by crossing the causeway. But when you got to the end of the causeway, coming from the general city of Shushan, you would be faced with the king's gate. And the king's gate was not just a door or an archway, it was a building. It was a large building. And the foundations show that it was 100 feet by 130 feet in dimension. And you entered the king's gate through one archway. The king's gate was a roofed structure. There were pillars that would have held up a roof. And you exited the king's gate through another archway, and you came into a square, into an open space, or a series of such open spaces. And the significance of the king's gate was this: it was a special place, a privileged place. If you were just an ordinary citizen, you could in fact bypass the king's gate. You could walk round it and enter these large open spaces. And that would be done by people who just wanted to come and ask a petition from the king. They wouldn't have to go through the king's gate. They could go round it and enter the main courtyard, from which they would be, if they were lucky, called in to see the king. Very, very few people actually had that privilege. But the king's gate was kept for special purposes. For example, when the king left his palace from the headquarters, he would drive through the king's gate in his horse and cart. There would be a wide enough way and high enough arches for the horse and carriage to be driven through. It was a ceremonial thing. And people were not allowed, the average person was not allowed into the king's gate. It was kept for meetings and assemblies of the councillors and important people and the servants of the king. And so when we read that Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate, it meant that he was there as a favoured person. And no doubt it was the queen, Esther, his daughter, as it were, who had become queen in the providence of God, who had requested that Mordecai be given the privilege of using the king's gate and of sitting there. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that Mordecai sat there all day long. I'm quite sure he didn't do that. I'm sure he had other business to do. What I think would have happened is that he came to the king's gate at certain times agreed with Esther, the queen. And Esther would then know he was there and could send a servant to fetch him. He couldn't go to the queen's house on his own initiative. He had to be taken there by a servant at the queen's invitation. But if she knew when he was going to be there, she could do that. And once he was taken into the queen's house, which opened off the main square, then he could commune with her and keep up to date with her, have private conversations with her. And that was the main purpose of Mordecai sitting in the king's gate, is waiting for a summons from the queen, his daughter. And that meant they could keep in close touch. It was only a matter of 30 or 50 yards from the king's gate to the queen's house. So that was what he was doing there. He was doing his purpose. He was awaiting the call of the queen. The purpose of the king's gate then was a special place which was used very often by people who were servants of the king. You may have noticed in reading the Old Testament that very frequently you're told that the elders of a walled city would meet at the gate. Now in that case it would be a simple gate, a simple entrance. But they would meet there. It was a sort of place that people in those days would gather to do official business. Now in this case, this was king's official business that was done, and it was done not at the gate, but in the gate. You might have wondered why the word "in" is used here. It was a building where people could meet together. And so that brings me to my second point. Mordecai saw the conspirators. Mordecai sat in the gate and he saw the conspirators. Now what exactly did Mordecai see? Very little detail is given to us in the text. We have to read between the lines. We have to imagine the situation or a reasonable scenario that would account for the fact that as we are told, it became known to Mordecai that there was a conspiracy afoot. We're told in verse 21, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, and this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Now, how exactly did it come to his knowledge? Well, as I say, we're not actually told. But what was it Mordecai saw? What I think is that he saw two men talking with raised voices in the king's gate, in the building. And he may well have approached them thinking that he might be able to intercede and settle their quarrel or whatever it was that was causing them to raise their voices in anger, as we're told. But as he approached, he realized that their anger was not with each other, but with the king himself. And Mordecai apparently was able to withdraw unseen, unnoticed by the conspirators. Now, we don't know why the conspirators were angry, but we know that they were sufficiently angry with the king to want to kill him, to lay hands upon him and kill him. But you might then say, well, why would they discuss such a matter in public? And the answer is not easy to give. If the King's Gate was crowded with other people, they would have been very foolish to talk about their conspiracy in the presence of other people. And one scenario is that the king had called a conference of his servants, which took place in a quite completely different building called the King's Hall. And there was a completely different building, which is in this far distant region of the palace from the gate. And all his servants were required to be there, and they were. So the King's Gate might well have been empty at that particular time, apart from Mordecai, who was not a servant of the king. He was there in a personal capacity as the queen's father, as it were. And so these conspirators might have said a good place to talk about our conspiracy would be the King's Gate, because it would be empty. Nobody will be there. And they hadn't thought of Mordecai. And indeed, Mordecai might have stepped out of the building for some fresh air, because in a very hot climate, that was probably necessary from time to time. And it may have been as he was returning to the King's Gate that he heard these raised voices, got near enough to hear what they were saying, realized that they were plotting the death of the king, and immediately he withdrew, and they didn't notice. Now, there's an application here that we need to take on board, and that is that even the most powerful, absolute monarch in that day had enemies. We don't know how many enemies he had, but there was an ample supply of potential enemies, because the majority of the population of this vast empire, 3,000 miles across, were actually people who had been dispossessed from their lands and from their countries by the Persian armies, Medo-Persian armies, and by earlier emperors like Nebuchadnezzar. The Assyrian Empire, for example, had removed the Jews from the northern kingdom of Israel and dispersed them around their own lands. And Nebuchadnezzar later had removed the Jews from Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel. This was all God's judgment upon a disobedient people. And they had been dispossessed of their lands. And that would have been true of almost all the lands that had been conquered by these various empires. And so the majority of the inhabitants would be descendants of the people who had been driven out of their lands by the Syrian Empire armies themselves, or by previous empires that had been taken over and captured, and their lands and possessions taken over by the Syrian Empire at this time the time of the day. So there were many, many potential enemies, people who remembered that perhaps 2, 3, 4 generations earlier, 5 generations earlier, their forefathers had been driven out of their lands by these various empires and their successors. But then, of course, there could be internal enemies, like these particular men. They were servants of the king. They were privileged to be keepers of the harem, and yet here they were plotting the downfall of their master. And we have no idea why, but they were certainly doing it. And although we can't draw any spiritual lesson from those particular events, we can draw a spiritual lesson by analogy. And the analogy is with the King of Kings, Almighty God. He has enemies. God has enemies. There are those who oppose God. There are those who battle against God. There are those who deny his existence. There are the works of Satan which seek to overthrow the works of God. They never succeed, of course, but nevertheless there is a battle, there is a spiritual warfare. And since we, if we are true Christians, Bible-believing Christians, are servants of the living God, we are embroiled in that battle. We are involved in that battle. And we are told this very clearly, of course, in the letter to the Ephesians, that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. As Christians, we wrestle, we fight, we're involved in this battle. And so the Apostle Paul says we must take to ourselves and put on the whole armor of God. And you're familiar, I think, with that passage. It's put on the helmet of faith and so on. We are involved in a battle, and if we are faithful to the word of God, if we are obedient to the commands of our King, we should be very conscious of that. Now, there's an interesting point that I can make here as following up on that analogy. And that is that Mordecai actually had 3 options when he discovered that this plot was afoot. And this, in fact, is the 3rd point I'm starting. There were 3 options. He could join the conspiracy, he could report the conspiracy, or he could ignore the conspiracy. Now you say, well, why might he have wanted to join it? Well, the answer is that he was one of those of the Jewish dispersion whose great-great-grandfather had been one of those taken by the Babylonians from Judah and taken not so much into captivity, but into a dispersed situation. Because these empires of old believed that once you took a people, a country, a people from their land, they lost their unity, they lost their identity. It was perhaps a rather superstitious thing to believe. But it was common practice. The Assyrians did it, and the Babylonians did it, and the Persians did it. They took people out of the land that they had conquered and dispersed them elsewhere. And Mordecai was a descendant of a displaced person, if you like. And as such, he might well have had no particular love for the powers that be in Persia. He could have said, well, it's time the Persians suffered as we suffered. Time their king got treated as our kings were treated. There was a possible motive, therefore. But of course, that was absolutely impossible for Mordecai because his daughter was the queen. And had the king been assassinated, then the queen would have ceased to be queen, because the next incoming king would want to bring his own queen into office and crown her. So Esther would have been decrowned, if you like. She would have lost her position of influence, and that position of influence was all central to the deliverance of the Jewish people, as we shall see as the book unfolds. So to join the conspiracy, quite apart from anything else, was an impossibility for Mordecai because of his relationship to the queen. Then the second option was to report the conspiracy, which is in fact what he did, and that has an application for us too. It was clearly a citizen's duty, in spite of the Jewish dispersion by successive empires, it was a necessity for a citizen to do his duty. And Mordecai was a citizen of the Persian Empire. And so there is a moral duty to obey the powers that be. Now, that is spelled out very clearly in the New Testament, isn't it? I'm going to read a passage from Romans 13. And the Apostle Paul, hundreds of years later, of course, was writing this. Let every person, this is Romans 13 and verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he, the authority, in this case the king, he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. It goes on to be very practical. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So there is an important lesson there, isn't there, for us from the book of Esther. Mordecai did the right thing. He reported this conspiracy to the king via Esther, and therefore she was able to inform the king, but she did so, and we have to notice this, she did so in the name of Mordecai. And that report was written in the Chronicles of the King. The third option, of course, that Mordecai had would be to ignore it, to say, no business of mine. I don't care what happens to the king. He does, of course, care, as we have seen, but I don't care. He could have ignored it and said, well, too bad, it's not my problem. It's somebody else's problem. He just turns his back and walks away and doesn't do anything about his discovery of this conspiracy. And I think there is a lesson here for us. Mordecai, in fact, really had no choice but to support the king. But we also have no choice when it comes to supporting the King of Kings. Now, this is really addressed to Christians. There are Christians who obey the King, who live by the Word of God, who seek to conform their lives to the Scriptures. They obey the commandments of God. They do the things that Jesus tells us to do, and they avoid the things that the Scriptures tell us to avoid. In other words, we try to regulate our lives by scriptural instruction and mold our lives to the will of God as expressed in the Scriptures. But there are many professing Christians, and I believe actually some real Christians, who do not do that. The Bible is not their rule of life. And they sometimes quite happily ignore what the Bible teaches and go their own way, do their own thing, because it pleases them. And they are not as concerned as they ought to be to please God. And Paul says, and we have often quoted this, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. That's a hard thing to do, but we must seek to do it. Even though we are sinners still, we must seek to do all things to the glory and praise of God. Well, then there's the overall application. Mordecai was God's instrument to bring about the cancellation of this conspiracy. It was him that God used to stop the assassination of the king. God was exercising his sovereign power, but he was doing through his servant Mordecai. And that is the lesson, perhaps, I want you to remember, that God uses us, uses believers, uses Christians to fulfill his purposes and to further his cause.